Hello, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackmon. I'm your host, David Blackmon, and my special guest today is someone I've admired for a long, long time, former Congressman Martin Frost, in whose district I lived for many years when I lived in Arlington, Texas, and Congressman Frost is now the Secretary and Director for the Council for a Secure America. Congressman, how are you today?
Doing fine, doing fine. You know, we talked about living in the district. These districts change all the time. So if you're a congressman from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, you have to be prepared to run anywhere in the Metroplex because you don't know what the legislature or the courts are going to do.
That's a big area, man. I tell you.
Oh yeah, but you don't ignore anybody.
Right, you can't. I can't. So I wanted to focus today on the work you're doing for the Council for a Secure America. You've been writing, you've written several op-eds recently, and touching on the importance of energy security, the growing, I think, rivalry between the United States and China for energy resources and supply chains around the country, and particularly how it's all impacting U.S. hegemony in the Middle East. And I write a lot about these things as well, and I just find myself agreeing with basically everything you've had to say on the subject.
Well, I'm sure there are a few places we're not in agreement, but that's okay. We won't talk about it.
Okay, yeah, we'll skip over those. Yeah. Well, you've the Council for Secure America. Just take a few minutes to talk about what that is, why it's important, and the work you're doing there.
Well, this is the second incarnation of this group. We started this. I was part of the original group back in the 1980s, and then it went dormant for a while. And then about 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of us revived it. And first of all, this is a combination of people from the Southwest who are in the energy business and people from the Northeast and other parts of the country who are strong supporters of the State of Israel. And we have always felt that the United States needs to produce as much energy as it can, because particularly now, because the energy is being used as a foreign policy weapon by the Russians to promote their particular policy right now in Ukraine and other places. And so it's always been our interest that the U.S. become as energy independent as possible. When we first started this, we were importing a lot of energy, a lot of oil and gas. And as you've gone on through the years, we've become much more self-sufficient. We still do import a little bit. We import some from Canada. Of course, they're our friend and our neighbor, so we're not worried about that. But it is in our interest to produce as much. We have great energy supplies, and there's no reason why we can't develop our energy for our own domestic consumption and have some of it available to promote democracy around the world. So this has been an interesting run. You and I were visiting a moment ago before we started. My family on both sides doesn't have any love for the Russians. My wife's family is originally from Ukraine. Her family's been in the United States for quite a while. Yeah. And my mother's family was from Lithuania. And so the Russians, of course, are up to no good right now in Ukraine, and the people in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and Poland are also keeping a wary eye on Russia because if they were successful in Ukraine, who knows who they'd come after next. And so it's in our interest to have a foreign policy that promotes democracy, that works with our allies in Europe. And this is very important because the Russians have tried to put pressure on our allies by withdrawing natural gas supplies from some of Western Europe, and hoping that the people would freeze and that they would turn against their government and against their policy. But those countries have rallied, and we've made it clear that we want to be helpful where we can in terms of, first of all, perhaps sending them some liquefied natural gas, also working with our ally in the Middle East, Israel, that is in the process of developing some natural gas fields in the Mediterranean. And some of that gas, hopefully, will eventually, working with Egypt, eventually be available to our Western European allies. And in terms of China, it's very interesting to me personally. I was a fellow at the Kennedy School, politics, after I left Congress. And as a part of that, we could take non-credit courses, audit courses in Harvard, because that's where the Kennedy School is located. And we could take up to 3 of these. And I took a course on the history of China. I figured that everybody who's involved in American policy needs to know something about China. And China is an extraordinary place. I mean, they first of all, they take the long view. They're not worried necessarily about next week or next year. They're worried about the next decade or the next century. So you have to really understand their mentality. And they're in this for the long haul, and we're in this for the long haul. It doesn't make any sense for us to say, well, we can't be involved in the rest of the world. That was the attitude that some people in the United States took in the 30s, in the time leading up to World War II. And they wanted to just kind of look the other way and let Nazi Germany do what it wanted to. That, fortunately, our government did not take that position, although there were people in the United States who advocated that. And we can't afford to let Russia have its way in Europe, and we can't afford to let China have its way throughout the Far East. So these are interesting times for us, but producing more energy from all sources. Let me be clear about this. We certainly advocate as much production of oil and gas as possible, but we also recognize that it's worthwhile developing some alternative sources.
Sure.
The issue, though, is that you can't have those overnight. You can't turn to alternative sources, wind, solar, and other uses immediately. But we're not opposed to the development over a period of time, as long as everyone recognizes in the United States that oil and gas are bridge fuels, and bridge fuels for a long time before we would become largely dependent upon other sources. So we've been working for a number of years, as I said, to do everything we can to make sure our government is as friendly as possible and the public is as friendly as possible to the oil and gas industry, because that's the basis. That's kind of the undercutting, under the beginning of a really good energy policy. You've got to have that before you can do anything else. And so this is an interesting group. We've been active over the years. We're a 501c3, which is a charitable group, which means that we can't lobby, but we can educate, and we can put on forums, we can write op-eds, or we can talk about the role of the oil and gas industry for our country, for our national defense, and for our position in the world. And that's really what we've been doing.
And it all points out, you talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the impacts it's had just globally, really, on energy flows and relationships. And doesn't it all really point to another theme I know you focus on in your writing on this, about energy security? Europe had put itself in a position where it was so reliant on Russia for that cheap natural gas.
That's right.
And it didn't really have, Germany in particular, but other countries as well, didn't really have any real level of energy security. And that's had major ramifications, really, not just in Europe, but in Pakistan, because it can't get LNG anymore. Talk about the energy security element of what you're
well, it is clearly,
trying to advocate for.
As I said, it's good for us, for our own country, and it's good for our friends in the world. The United States, ever since World War II, has been recognized as the leader of the world. Now, we're being challenged by China economically, as well as some other ways, but it is in our best interest to maintain this leadership position, both in Europe and in Asia, and we're capable of doing that. We don't, it's not an either or proposition. We can't just say, well, we'll do some things to help our European allies, but we won't worry about Asia, or we can't just switch to Asia and disregard what's going on in Europe. So, and it's because of some changes in our production. I mean, one of the organizers, founders of our organizations, Harold Hamm, I think you're familiar with him.
Yes.
And Harold used a combination of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling to free up oil and gas in shale areas where previously it was not thought that was economical, but he demonstrated that it was. And so we've increased our own production significantly in recent years. And there are some people in the country who would say, very peculiar position, quite frankly, I think, leave it in the ground. I mean, I don't understand that at all. But there's some people who don't want us to develop any more oil and gas. I mean, there are legitimate environmental concerns. Don't get me wrong.
Sure.
I'm not saying that we should ignore the environment, but the extreme position of leave it in the ground, don't drill any place, that's nuts. And so we've tried to make it clear that it is in our interest, our own security interest, and our own economic interest to make sure that we develop the resources that we have. And we've been very fortunate, very blessed that we do have very significant energy resources, and we are now in a position where we're not completely and solely reliant on our own fuel developed in the United States, but largely reliant on what we have here. And that we do have, particularly in the area of natural gas, we have the opportunity to provide some help to our friends and also to export oil to around the world. There was a period of time starting back in the Nixon administration where we banned the export of crude oil.
Right.
You could export refined products, gasoline, others, but you couldn't export crude oil. And some of us were involved in that effort. And Harold really played a significant role in that.
He did, yes.
Making it clear that it's in our interest to be able to export crude oil to so some of our friends will have an additional source that they would not otherwise have. But to do that, you have to keep producing here in the United States in a very significant way, and we're for that.
Well, one of the areas where China, we talk about China, is really challenging, seems to be anyway. United States influence is in the Middle East. We just saw this in mid-March, this deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran to reestablish long dead diplomatic relations, and that deal brokered by China. Is the U.S. losing influence in the Middle East? Is that a dangerous thing
for
our country?
It could be. We're not to the point where we're losing it right now, but we have to be very much aware of what's going on. I've never been a particular fan of Saudi either. We like to think that we have had historically decent relationships with Saudi Arabia, but when we need them now, we've asked them to increase their production so that the price of gasoline at the pump won't go up. But they've refused, and OPEC has refused to increase their production. So, I think their relationship with China may be a part of that, quite frankly. This is a complicated world that we're in, but we have to understand that we have some friends, but some of our friends are a little lukewarm from time to time. And we need to make sure that we're in a strong position to be a dominant force or a major force, both in the Middle East, Europe, and in China. We're a world power, and I don't think that the people of the United States want to walk away from our leading position of being a world power. But part of that is using energy, not necessarily exactly the way the Russians do, but taking advantage of our domestic production so that we can promote our friends and promote democracy around the world. And it doesn't surprise me that the Saudis who have not gotten along with the Iranians for a long period of time, might have decided, well, they'll play nice with the Iranians. Well, thanks a lot, fellas. We've tried to maintain a good relationship with the Saudis, and we can't just walk away from that. But I think we need to watch them very closely. And we have, over the years, as I think we've sold them a lot of weapons. And
a lot of weapons, yes.
And they have a small population. They're a big country with a small population. And so they want to have the most sophisticated weapons available. We have provided that to them, but there may be a time where we're not going to do that anymore.
So I've always wondered, and another part of what your group is doing is advocating for a stronger relationship between the United States and Israel.
Right.
And I've always wondered how the government of Israel views it when the United States agrees to supply arms to Saudi Arabia. Now, the tension is not as great between those countries as it has been in the past, but it always feels like to me something that Israel's government may have not a great feeling about when we're
Well,
supplying such sophisticated arms to Saudi Arabia and other countries.
yeah, well, we're going to see exactly what happens. During the Trump administration, we started the Abraham Accords and encouraging some of the Arab countries to basically make peace with Israel, to have diplomatic relations and have economic partnerships. And Israel has developed a lot of high technology, and this is of interest to a number of those countries in the Middle East. And the Saudis are trying to have it both ways. They want to the extent that they can work with Israel, particularly on technology, they want that. But they also are not necessarily willing to be very helpful in other ways, both to Israel or the United States. And so we have to stand firm. We have to make it pretty clear to the Saudis that we will continue to try and do business with you, but not if you're trying to undercut our foreign policy in Europe by dealing with the Russians.
Another country that back to Russia, has really developed much stronger ties with since the invasion of Ukraine is India. And that's been motivated mainly by the need to sell oil to someone and India's willingness to buy it.
Yeah.
Does the council have, similar concerns about this growing relationship between Russia and India, similarly
well,
to
it's
Russia
not necessarily something that we've gotten into at this point, but certainly that is something you have to pay attention to. And, the India, since it became independent, and it's only been independent since the late 1940s. I mean, they were part of Britain prior to that.
Right.
India has had its own historic problems with Pakistan. And so India has wanted to make sure that they are in a good shape if they ever have to go to war with Pakistan. And, we've tried to be friendly with India. I'm not happy with the role that they're playing right now, but you have to limit your targets here. You limit your opportunity. I'm sure that our government is having serious conversations with India right now. The Russians have been able to maintain this war against Ukraine because they've had to continue to have a market for their oil, a market around the world. And our European allies in Western Europe have tried to put a ceiling on what they'll pay for Russian energy, and so that the Russians just can't keep raising the prices. But Russia has been able to sell to China, has been able to sell to India, and they have used their energy supplies effectively. And that's why we have to remain a strong energy producer. We can't just cede the field to them, because Russia's not in great shape economically, and their military is not as good as they thought it was going to be. But they're not going away. They're not going anyplace. And they historically had great influence among their neighboring countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, right after World War II. And we have to realize that those countries have become friends of ours after they threw off the Russian yoke originally, after the Berlin Wall opened. And Poland actually has been a very good friend of the United States and has played an instrumental role in our efforts in Ukraine. And so it's in our interest to tell the Russians there is a point beyond which you can't go, and you better stay away and stay out of those countries that once were part of your satellite countries, but which now are independent and in many cases democratic. That doesn't mean they all have a democracy exactly the way we do, but it's really important that the Russians understand that the United States is in this for keeps, that we will stand firm and do what we can. We're not sending troops to Ukraine, but we need to supply as much as we can, much weaponry, modern weaponry, sophisticated weaponry as we can. And it's a good message to send to the Russians and to the Chinese. The Chinese need to understand that we're not going to walk away from Ukraine, because if we did, they'd go after Taiwan tomorrow if they thought the United States was not a dependable ally. And we have a very constructive role to play in maintaining as much peace as you can around the world. And I would hate to see us withdraw from the rest of the world, because we are a great country and we're capable of great things. And as a great country, we have a role to play in providing leadership, and I hope that we'll continue to do that. But the Russians are tough people. Nobody should take them lightly. They, as you can see from the media coverage, they are mean, tough folks once they get into a battle. Now, they are disappointed. I know that Putin and the people around him are disappointed that the Ukrainians have proved to be tough too, and the Ukrainians have stood their ground. I think they thought they would just walk over Ukraine. They would be there, and within a matter of weeks or months, all of Ukraine would be theirs. That did not happen, and I hope that we will make sure it doesn't happen. But it does have implications on aggressive actions by China, because if China gets the idea that we are not we're not good allies for our friends, they will push as far as they can. And we're in a great economic battle with China. No one expects us to go to war with China anytime soon, although you never know in this crazy world. But we're in an economic battle with China, and they need to understand that we still are a major power militarily and economically. And we don't want to do anything to encourage them to take an aggressive stance in Asia and try and take over countries the way Russia is trying to take over Ukraine.
Yeah, and that economic rivalry with China, a lot of that revolves around energy and not just oil, right? I mean, does it concern the council, you and the council, when we see China now striking a deal with Bolivia, which has some of the richest lithium deposits on Earth, to develop that country's lithium now really is kind of a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. That's a big inroad into the lithium triangle, which is a resource that I know the Biden administration has wanted to target for some of the lithium supplies we're going to need for renewable energy and batteries here in the United States. When we see China moving into South America in such a big way, is that something we should be concerned about?
The answer is yes, and I have some good friends who are active across the world. I was the chairman of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy during the last 4 years of the Obama administration, and some of my friends who are very active in world affairs told me in the last couple of years, watch out for China. They're making a big move into South America. And so, listen, we're a great country. We're a world power. And we have to do everything we can, wherever it's feasible, to make sure our friends are okay, and to have good relationships with countries that historically have been our friends, but now may be in an economic position where they are willing to do business with the other side.
Well, and the inroads in South America are not limited to Bolivia. That also includes Brazil, which is part of the BRICS alliance with China and Russia and India and South Africa.
Yeah, and don't forget about Venezuela.
And Venezuela as well, right? And it's really becoming quite a trend, I think, for China to be in there. And when you look at the BRICS alliance, the G7 just completed a ministerial meeting here this past weekend. Well, the BRICS alliance now has a larger collective GDP than the G7, which is an extraordinary development. And I mean, do you see the BRICS alliance also kind of helping to facilitate the growth of China's influence globally?
Well, it's something we have to be aware of. I'm not sure what the answer to that is.
Yeah.
But you're talking about the second tier of nations, but there were very significant nations economically, and you're talking about China and India, and there are 3 or 4 others. I'm not sure whether Australia is a part of that now. Brazil is a part of it, though. And
South Africa is.
South Africa, which is very curious, quite frankly, that they would be a part of that, but that's their business. The point is that we can't walk away from the world. We can't just pull our horns in and say, well, we're fine here in the United States, and we don't have to worry about anything that's going on anywhere else. We have to take a world view and use our economic power and our economic influence where we can. And we still are a wealthy, great country. And one of the things that will continue us as a wealthy, great country is being able to maximize our production of energy. And again, I want to be very clear. We're not talking about ignoring environmental issues. We want as much safety as possible. We want things done in an environmental way, but we have to continue to develop one of our really great natural resources. And you've got extreme people on both sides. That's what's very interesting. You've got extreme people on the liberal side who say keep it in the ground, and you've got extreme people on the conservative and Republican side who say America first, don't worry about any place else. Well, that's it. We can't do that. We are first, and we need to keep it that way. And part of that is being aware of what's going on in the rest of the world and using our influence and our economic power where we can.
So last question. We're running up against time, but last question. Is it possible for America or really any other country to have what we like to refer to as a true sense of national security without having energy security at the same time?
No, certainly it's not possible for the United States.
Yeah.
And we have this great resource, and it's very interesting. Some of the people who were critical of the Biden administration because of their policy on drilling in Alaska. Well, the Biden administration has agreed to open up some of the area in Alaska for drilling that previously hadn't been. They understand the economic questions involved. They understand how we remain a great country. And they've also put money, or in the process, they've approved some development along the Gulf Coast of the United States that you need to be able to export crude oil, which while we eliminated the ban on exporting, we also need the infrastructure to be able to do that. And we need the infrastructure to be able to continue to develop and export liquefied natural gas. So this is a complicated question. There are no simple answers to this, but we're a group of folks kind of in the middle politically who want to see the United States remain strong and vital and also energy self-sufficient to the extent it's humanly possible to be.
Well, Congressman, I can't thank you enough for your time. I appreciate the work you're doing on behalf of the council and really admire it and really appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you for taking the interest. And I'm going to be down in Dallas in a couple of weeks. So I've got to give a speech down there, and I'll see some of my family. Still have some family in Texas. And we're kind of traveling around. We've got a granddaughter who's graduating from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. We have to go to that.
Oh, wow.
We have a grandson who's graduating from the University of North Carolina Graduate School in library science and information science. And then we have, my wife and I have 13 grandchildren. And, and some of them are in the process of applying for college. And so we've encouraged them to aim high. Aim high when you're in terms of education.
That's fantastic.
So one of our granddaughters was here a couple of weeks ago looking at some colleges in the Washington, D.C. area. I have another one who's a year younger than she is, who's looking at colleges on the East Coast. And maybe we'll get some of them to go to school in Texas. I don't know. but
there's lots of good schools out there.
Oh yeah. Well, my parents graduated from the University of Texas. That's where they met. And one of my daughters went to the University of Texas as a graduate degree from North Texas. So we've still got a strong interest in what's going on in their state. But my attitude is go to the best place you can. And the best place you can afford, which is the second part of that equation.
That's the second part. Yeah, that's for sure.
Well,
thank you so much, and best of luck and safe travels, and hopefully we'll talk to you again sometime in the future.
Love to do it.
All right.
Thanks for your time. All right.
Thank you. And that's all for today's episode of The Energy Question. Appreciate everyone joining us. Thanks to the Sandstone Group for hosting our show and to our extraordinary producer, Eric Perel. I'm David Blackmon, signing off for now.